Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again. We're going to talk about the beginnings of the major phase of the civil rights movement that began after the end of the Second World War. You may recall from our previous program that after the war was over, many Black Americans, women, and other minority groups hoped that the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan would lead not only to world peace, but also peace and equality at home. Eventually, that proposal became the centerpiece of American domestic policy during the 1950s and 1960s. And today, we are going to talk about that development and see where it led the country, as well as it led Black and white Americans, men and women, to understand that we were not yet at that moment that was promised in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. So let us begin. You may remember this map from our previous program, and this is the map of the 1944 presidential election. Again, the Democrats are blue and the Republicans are red. And as you can see here, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Democratic candidate, won relatively easily against his Republican opponent. This map is really not so unusual because in 1944, as in 1940, 1936, and going all the way back to the end of the American Civil War in 1865, all of the southern states, the former states of the Confederate States of America, the American South, all voted Democratic. But this would be the last election where the southern states were solidly for the Democratic Party. In the 1948 presidential election, when Harry Truman, the Democratic candidate, who had been president since the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in April of 1945, when Truman ran for his first full term, the Republicans nominated the governor of New York, Thomas E. Dewey. But the 1948 presidential election marked the first time since the end of the Civil War that the South was not solid for the Democratic Party. And as you can see from this map, 4 states in the South did not vote for the Democratic candidate. They did not vote for the Republican candidate either, but rather for their own political party, the Dixiecrats. Because white people living in the South, particularly the Deep South, were concerned that the Democrats were moving toward placing before Congress a package of civil rights measures that would move Black Americans closer to full equality. And in fact, this is exactly what President Harry Truman did in 1948, an election year, as you can see. He submitted the first civil rights program to Congress for their legislation, the first time since a Civil Rights Act was put before the Congress since 1875, many years earlier. Uh, the package was dead on arrival because the key committee chairmanships in the Congress were held by Southern Democrats. Because there was essentially just one political party in the South, the Democratic Party. Southern Democrats had built up seniority to the point where they led most of the key committees in Congress because committee leadership was at that time based upon seniority. But it was clear from the election outcome that civil rights would become probably the defining domestic issue of the decade of the 1950s. Now, in 1952, the Democratic Party, as we say here in the South, got religion. What that means has nothing to do with religion. It means that they came back. That is, they retreated on Harry Truman's civil rights platform and measures. And the Democratic Party candidate that year, Adlai Stevenson, who is from Illinois, up here in the Midwest, decided that he would not make civil rights a significant issue or any issue at all for the Democratic Party. And to emphasize that, he selected as his vice president John Sparkman, a senator from Alabama. And that told white Southern voters the Democratic Party is back with us. None of this race stuff, none of this civil rights stuff. So it looked like the initiative of Harry Truman in 1948 would just disappear. But as it turned out, the Republican Party candidate, World War II general and hero Dwight D. Eisenhower, had different ideas. Actually, the first inkling of Eisenhower's views on civil rights did not come from Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose picture you see here, but rather from his wife, Mamie Eisenhower. It was and still is a tradition that school children from Washington, D.C. schools, where, of course, the White House is located, would come to the lawn on the White House before Easter and have an Easter egg roll. It was a tradition that extended back into the 19th century. And traditionally, the First Lady was in charge of organizing the Easter egg roll on the White House lawn. And when Eisenhower was inaugurated in January of 1953, a month later, Mamie Eisenhower was informed that she should send out invitations to 4 elementary schools in Washington, D.C., for their students to come and participate in the Easter egg roll on the White House lawn. And Mimi Eisenhower thought, there have to be more than 4 elementary schools in a big city like Washington, D.C. Do they rotate them every year? I mean, and so she asked, and she said, and she was told, those are the white schools, because Washington, D.C. was basically a southern city. And like many southern cities, they had 2 school systems, a white system and a black system. And traditionally, it was only the white elementary schools that were invited to the Easter egg roll. And Mamie Eisenhower, who was from Denver, Colorado, and totally clueless as to Southern customs, said, "No, I want all the kids to come." And she was told, "Oh, you can't do that. Oh, it's going to upset a lot of. I want all the kids to come." And they came. And her husband, whom you see here, Dwight D. Eisenhower, said that this was really a good idea. And you know what I'm going to do? I am going to desegregate Washington, D.C. It is shameful that the capital of the United States of America is segregated by race. And the first thing I'm going to do is sign a law ending segregation in Washington, D.C. And he did so in 1953. Now, not only was Washington, D.C. segregated, but when Harry Truman was president, he ordered the desegregation of all military bases. Well, what happened was all of the military bases in the north and in the west of the United States ended racial segregation, but not in the South. And when Truman complained about this, he was told, well, it's going to create a tremendous amount of trouble. And we need to have our military forces in good shape because we are now engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. So we cannot have internal complications. We cannot have internal strife. And certainly the desegregation of military bases in the American South would do exactly that. Well, Eisenhower, who was, of course, the commanding general of the Allied forces in World War II, said, nah, that's not going to work in my administration. I order you to desegregate. And the commanders of these forts reluctantly did so. And surprisingly enough, there were no incidents of retribution. There were no incidents of violence. As soldiers, white and black Americans complied with the president's order. Now, Eisenhower was a very interesting fellow, and he said it was very difficult for him to take no for an answer. To give you one example, in 1919, after he had graduated from West Point, and this was way before he became the commanding general of the Allied forces in World War II, uh, he was ordered to send military equipment from Washington, D.C. to California. Why? Well, the Americans were concerned about the buildup of the military might of the Empire of Japan. And Washington, D.C. is a long way from Japan, but California is closer. So they needed some military presence in California. Now, the problem was there were very few roads that connected the East Coast with the West Coast. And Congress wanted to see how long it would take to move military equipment on roads between Washington, D.C. and the West Coast. And it took Eisenhower and his crew more than 2.5 months to make that trip. A trip today that would take, if you drove without stopping, that would take less than 3 days. Uh, and the problem was the roads were terrible. And here you see some military equipment and what they had to negotiate. And that journey was extremely important because in 1955, many years later, when Eisenhower had become president, one of his biggest legislative initiatives was to build interstate highways to connect the East Coast of America with the West Coast. It was the biggest, and still is today, it was the biggest public works project in American history, building this interstate highway network. And the only way Eisenhower could get it by Congress was to call it a Defense Act. That is, well, we got to move our military equipment across country. We got to do it quickly. We got to build these roads. In practice, of course, it became a great boon to the American people. Now they can get in their automobiles and take trips to the national park. They could take trips to the great cities of America. They could go to Washington, D.C. without having to be concerned of encountering conditions like what you see here. Another thing about Eisenhower was that he was very concerned about the Soviet Union. Not so much that the Soviet Union would attack the United States, but there were members of his party and in the Democratic Party who wanted to have a stronger military presence against the Soviet Union. Now, here you see General Eisenhower at the end of World War II presenting a medal to Marshal Zhukov, the head of the Soviet forces in World War II. And in fact, until Eisenhower left office in 1961, he and Zhukov remained friends. And why not? They were allies in defeating Nazi Germany. And when the Soviets put Sputnik, and you all probably remember or have heard of Sputnik, into space in 1957, Congress wanted to develop weapons to shoot down Soviet satellites. And Eisenhower vetoed that proposal. Now, Eisenhower was very close to his mother, and you can see this picture here. His mother was really an amazing woman. His father had difficulties holding a job. When Eisenhower was born, his father's job was to clean locomotives on trains. And obviously that was a very low paying job. But his mother was extremely bright. In fact, she memorized the Bible. And if any of you have ever had to memorize passages of the Bible, you know how difficult that can be. But she memorized the entire Bible. She was just a brilliant woman. She was also a pacifist. And when it was time for Dwight Eisenhower to go to college, his family could not afford to send him to college. But West Point, the United States Military Academy, was an institution that was free. You didn't have to pay anything. And so Eisenhower went to West Point. And his mother was very upset at that because obviously, if you're a pacifist, you're not raising your son to be in the army. But he went anyway and excelled there. And she eventually made her peace with that. Now, after World War II, Eisenhower became president of Columbia University, one of the finest academic institutions in America. And here you see him with a machine called a cyclotron, which is necessary for medical research. He was also a great advocate of immigration because he believed that immigrants were necessary to build America and to create new things and develop new ideas. And here you see him in front of the White House with a group of people who were just becoming new American citizens. One of the scourges of the 1950s, when Eisenhower was president, was polio. And it struck primarily children. And there was no cure for it. And sometimes children became paralyzed or partially paralyzed. This young girl, Millie Cox, is a neighbor of mine here in Charlotte. She is still alive, and she still has difficulty walking because she was stricken with polio in 1953. However, one of the things that Eisenhower did, because he believed that government must do what individual people cannot do or afford to improve the lives of all Americans. And he often said, hey, we cannot have a budget from the 1890s. We need a budget for the 1950s. And basic research was something that was so expensive that the private sector really could not afford to support it. So he established the National Institutes of Health to increase the likelihood that we could find cures to the diseases that were plaguing mankind, and particularly children, including polio. And one of those grants went to this gentleman, Jonas Salk. And I know this personally because my uncle was a student at the University of Pittsburgh in biochemistry in the 1950s. And Jonas Salk taught and researched at the University of Pittsburgh, and my uncle was one of his graduate assistants while Salk was in the process of inventing the polio vaccine that ultimately wiped out the disease. So it was interesting because Salk was a son of Russian Jewish immigrants. And this was one of the main arguments Eisenhower used against limiting immigration from Europe or other parts of the world, that we would be a lesser country if we did not invite people like Jonas Salk's parents to come to America and make America a better country. But perhaps the key aspect of Eisenhower's presidential administrations, and there were two of them, he was reelected, was when in 1954, the US Supreme Court struck down segregation in education. Here you see a Black mother with her daughter, and the headline, High Court bans segregation in public schools. That decision came down in May of 1954. And I can tell you, every white person, most white people in the South were condemning Eisenhower. Why? Well, Eisenhower did not sit on the Supreme Court, but Eisenhower had nominated several of the Supreme Court justices. And specifically, before he nominated them, he asked them, if a segregation case comes before your court, how will you rule? Will you strike down segregation as a violation of the US Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equality for all? Will you strike it down, or will you support segregation? That was the test for his interviews for nominating justices to the US Supreme Court. and that was a landmark decision. However, in the American South, the ruling of the Supreme Court striking down racial segregation was not obeyed. This is Joanne Robinson, a professor at Alabama State University, a black school in Montgomery, Alabama, and she was arrested. And she's holding her arrest number for her mugshot. She was arrested because she was organizing a demonstration against racial segregation in Montgomery, Alabama. And this woman, whose name was Rosa Parks, also was arrested. One day, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, who, unlike most black people in Alabama, had a high school degree and had done some college work, but as a black woman, she could find no work that was equal to her intellectual abilities or her education. So she worked in the department store as a seamstress. That is, she sewed garments in the department store. And in December, it's very, very busy in department stores because it's the Christmas shopping season beginning then. And she had been standing on her feet, ironing and basting and sewing for 12 hours that day. And she was tired. So when she took her bus home to where she lived, she saw that there were no seats in the back of the bus because in those days, all southern cities had segregation in public transportation. And black people sat in the back of the bus, white people in the front of the bus. And if all of the seats were full and a white person came on the bus, a black person would have to get up and give that seat to the white person. But Rosa Parks was tired. And she decided that when the bus driver said, move, she did not move. She stayed in her seat. And she was arrested for violating the order. And that began a 13-month boycott led by Martin Luther King Jr., who was a graduate student at Boston University and had come to Montgomery to finish his doctoral dissertation in a nice, quiet southern town where he also could get some money being a minister. Well, nice and quiet did not work either for Montgomery or for Dr. King. And he led a 13-month boycott of the bus system in Montgomery. And eventually, the US Supreme Court struck down segregation in public transportation. And here you see a painting by the great black artist Charles Henry Alston, recalling the bus boycotts of the 1950s, where you have Black people who walked to work, who walked to school, who walked to the grocery store rather than ride the bus. Now, of course, it wasn't only public accommodations that were segregated in the South in the 1950s. It was also the public schools. And a Black woman from Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, Daisy Bates, whom you see here, decided it was time to desegregate the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. But the governor of Arkansas, Governor Orville Faubus, said no. We are not going to comply with the U.S. Supreme Court. We are going to comply with the segregation laws of the state of Arkansas. So Eisenhower called him to Washington and said, look, Orville, this is a decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. And as a state, you must comply with this federal ruling. And Orville Faubus told Eisenhower, okay, Mr. President, I'm going to go back to Arkansas and I'm going to comply with your order. But when he went back to Arkansas, he was thinking, I want to run for re-election as governor. And if I allow the schools in Little Rock or any part of Arkansas to be desegregated, I'm going to lose. Because, of course, Black people couldn't vote in Arkansas, only whites. So I'm going to lose. So I'm not going to comply with that order. So what happened was, when 9 Black children entered Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and you can see them walking here. And Little Rock, Arkansas had about, the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas had nearly 2,000 students. So we're talking about 9 Black students out of 2,000. The city rioted and prevented these Black children from attending the school. So what did President Eisenhower do? Because again, this was an order by the Supreme Court. What he did, for the first time since the American Civil War in the 1860s, he sent the U.S. Army, the 101st Airborne Division, based in Kentucky. He sent the Army into a southern state. First time since the Civil War. And here you see soldiers from the U.S. Army protecting these 9 Black students who were trying to get an education at Little Rock's Central High School. And you can see one of the students here, Elizabeth Eckford, and these are white students from the high school, including this woman. And you can see this white woman is not happy with having Elizabeth Eckford as a fellow student. I point her out. This picture appears in one of the books that I've written. And I point her out because the 40th anniversary of the integration of Central High School in 1997 I was invited to Little Rock for a dinner commemorating that event. And during the dinner, an elderly woman came up to me and she said, "My picture is in your book." And she told me her name, and the name didn't mean anything. So all I had was a picture. No names except, of course, for Elizabeth Eckford. And she said, "Yeah, I'm the white woman screaming obscenities at Elizabeth Eckford." And to make a long story short, she said that she was so ashamed about what she did that she joined the Little Rock Civil Rights Commission to ensure greater equality between black and white citizens of Little Rock, Arkansas. So there is such a thing as redemption. Now, the South was still in 1957. Yes, some schools were integrated, some public transportation, but most of the South was still segregated. This is my hometown, Memphis, Tennessee. And if I wanted to go to the zoo on a Tuesday, I could not go to the zoo on Tuesday. Why? You see the sign, "No white people allowed in zoo today." Memphis Park Commission. Oh, what's that all about? Well, Tuesday was the day set aside for black people to go to the zoo. Now, is that crazy? I mean, when you look back on it, it's just weird. But that's the way you lived the life. You lived as part of a racial group. And of course, if you were white, you were automatically privileged, except that you could not go to the zoo on Tuesday. My parents used to tell me that one of the things they liked to do on a Saturday night was go to the rooftop of the Peabody Hotel and dance to the big bands like Glenn Miller, for example. But black people could not do that. They could not even enter the Peabody Hotel unless they were working there as janitors. So it was not only a system of racial segregation, it was a system of racial humiliation. Because if you were black, you couldn't go certain places. If you were black, you had to go to rundown schools. If you were black, you lived in a rundown neighborhood. If you were black, you could only go to the zoo on Tuesday. Too bad if you had something else to do, because the rest of the week you could not go to the zoo. And if you wanted to shop for your Easter clothes or for your graduation, yeah, you could go to Goldsmith's department store in Memphis, but you could only go on a Thursday night to shop. And Memphis was not unusual. These laws existed throughout the entire South. And not only in department stores, but in housing as well. And these are pickets at a housing development in Florida. And you can see the signs they are carrying. We intend to keep this neighborhood white. Out with NAACP. That was the National Association uh, for the Advancement of Colored People, a civil rights group. And what about this sign that this woman is carrying? We want this, and you can see the word here, moved, because a black person had moved into this house. Now, Dwight D. Eisenhower, you can see initially was a very popular president. I mean, when your approval ratings are in the 70s, that's good. But look what happened when he sent these troops into Little Rock, Arkansas. It plummeted. And this is not only in the South, this is nationally. It was interesting, but the Gallup poll in 1952 asked Americans what were the most important domestic issues. And only 6% of Americans said civil rights. Just 6%. So this was not something that Eisenhower did to boost his political profile. This was something he did because he believed in racial equality. And his numbers didn't appear to increase that much, but of course, when he left, people were sorry to see him go. There was another frontier, and that was higher education. The university I teach at was segregated, whites only, because that was the state law in North Carolina. It was also true in the state of Oklahoma. And the Supreme Court struck down racial segregation in higher education, just as the Supreme Court struck down racial segregation in the public schools. Well, you can see what happened here at the University of Oklahoma. Yeah, they let this black man in, but you can see where he's sitting. He's sitting outside the classroom, and the white students are sitting inside the classroom. The Supreme Court said, no, this is not going to work, obviously. So what the University of Oklahoma did, he went into the classroom, but they roped off a row of seats so that only he would sit in that row. And what the white students did when they saw this was tear down the rope, saying this is really ridiculous. So it wasn't only the passage of laws, it was the actions of people themselves that struck down racial segregation. But there were places around the city where black people could not go. It wasn't only a question of, okay, whites here, blacks there. It was a question of exclusion. And one of the places they couldn't go to were lunch counters, like the one you see here in Greensboro, North Carolina. And on January 31st, 1960, these four students were in their dorm rooms at a black school in Black College in Greensboro, North Carolina. And they had an assignment to write a paper on race and the US Constitution. And in the course of talking about it and doing research about it, they said, let's do something about it. So the next day, February 1st, 1960, they went down to the Woolworth department store that had a lunch counter, and they sat down against the law and ordered hamburgers. And you can see the waiter here, who is also black, and he doesn't know exactly what to do. Should he serve his brothers, or should he abide by the law and risk losing a job and maybe never working again? Well, they weren't served. They were arrested. But that began the sit-in movement. And suddenly the civil rights movement shifted from the halls of Congress, from the US Supreme Court, from the passive nature of boycotts into an activist movement. And we will talk about that activist movement next time. But in the meantime, a new president succeeded Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy did not have much of a civil rights record, but the hope was that with a new young president and a new young family, and here you can see the 1960 presidential map between Kennedy, the Democrat, and Richard Nixon, the Republican, and you can see again the solid South. Nixon managed to make inroads in Virginia and Tennessee, but otherwise the South was solid because John Kennedy didn't say anything about civil rights. And in fact, he asked for his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson from Texas. And of course, Lyndon B. Johnson, like most Southern senators, was a segregationist. So it appeared safe now for the South now that Eisenhower was gone. And we all love this young family. So what would happen to civil rights, especially now that it moved into a more active, more confrontational phase? What would this new administration do, and how it would interact with the political issues that this would raise, as well as the moral issues? And for that story, tune in next week. Thank you.